Welcome, Mike.
Good afternoon, Shervin.
Good afternoon.
It's good to be here.
Great. Please allow me to say one sentence in German for the audience before I completely switch to English. So,
Certainly.
meine Damen, meine Herren, jetzt noch einmal der Hinweis, wenn Sie also jetzt dann der deutschen Übersetzung folgen möchten, bitte über den Button auf Ihrer Website auf den anderen Kanal wechseln. Und bei der Gelegenheit vielleicht auch schon, weil vielleicht der eine oder andere oder die eine oder andere sich ausklinken muss, wir haben einen Link unterhalb des Bildschirms, da steht Feedback. Mit diesem Feedback kommen Sie auf eine Umfrageseite und wir würden uns sehr, sehr freuen, wenn Sie uns wirklich, wenn möglichst alle uns ein Feedback zu dieser Konferenz geben können. Und am besten auch gleich, vielleicht im Laufe der letzten Session, bevor Sie rausgehen oder kurz nachdem Sie rausgehen heute, unbedingt von diesem Feedback leben wir und dazu lade ich Sie jetzt schon herzlich ein. All right, now I switch to English again. Mike, it is great to see you. I hope you're doing well. How is it in the US? How is it with you and your family? How are you doing?
I'm doing very well as my family. And so obviously crazy times, but for the most part, we've all made it through so far and we expect to make it through the end. So thank you for asking, Shervin.
All right, thank you very much. We would have loved to have you here in Berlin, as also I know you would have loved to be here together with your wife, which was the original plan. So, but we really appreciate it that you take your time and you support us in this conference, also in these circumstances. Thank you very much. I would like to introduce you to our audience, Mike, before we start with your presentation and also with our interview. As I said, we are delighted to have Mike Staun here today, and he will tell us his personal story and also the story of the company, the consumer product giant Procter & Gamble, in their move towards lean integrated project delivery, how they call it. Mike has retired from P&G in the meanwhile last year after a 36-year career. And in his last assignment at P&G, he was responsible for capital management across the globe. And it was in this role where Mike led the move to Lean IPD. Currently, Mike is a senior advisor to McKinsey & Company in their capital projects and infrastructure practice, and he is helping owners to make the move towards Lean IPD. He has also served, and this is something that we have in common. He has also served in the board of directors of the Lean Construction Institute, in this case in the United States. And he is currently serving as the chairman of the board. And I had the privilege to be with you last year in October at your congress and also at your board meeting. And it was amazing what movement there is going on in that regard. And so it's really great to have you here, Mike. And I should add that Mike emphasized that he would really love to come into interaction with the audience. So again, as we had it through the day, I invite everyone to give comments through the chat, to give us questions. We will have enough time for questions. And also, we have decided to do the presentation, even in the presentation, in a kind of an interactive format. So we will have 10 prepared questions. I will give those questions to Mike, and in the first 20-minute block, Mike will give answers to those questions, and after that, we will move into the Q&A with the audience. So far the introduction, and I think we can now go into the presentation. I don't know, Mike, would you like to add something as an introductory note before we go into the first question?
I think the one thing is as you look at this title page, the journey to Lean IPD, the one thing's up there is more value, less waste, and smooth flow. And that's kind of the overarching message I think that everybody should take into this, is that we're really looking for value. One of the ways we get that is through less waste. And a lot of times we don't see the waste until we see are able to really look at the flow. And so I think that's, one of the top messages that everybody ought to, in any kind of lean endeavor ought to start with. So that's the only thing I'd say there.
All right.
And thank you very much also for the kind introductory remarks. It's been my pleasure to work with LCI and to be part of their board and to help other owners go ahead and make this journey, as well as to help a lot of the design firms and engineering firms, the general construction firms, the trade partners, and everybody else, to try to figure out how we can come together and really work better together and achieve that type of value. So that would just be the overarching comments that I'd like to make.
All right, thank you very much. Then let's start with the first question, and that would be, obviously, what was the starting point and the motivation from Procter & Gamble to start that journey?
Sure. So I think the starting point for any organization is you have to build a business case. And so for us, when we looked at Lean, we had seen what Lean had done in manufacturing. And so we were very interested to see what Lean might be able to do in project delivery. And so this list on this slide, it lists what I would call the 7 benefit areas. And so whenever you're doing a project, you ought to look at how Lean is going to help you in these 7 areas. And the top of the list is value, but you also, cost is important, schedule, quality, safety, certainly culture, the kind of culture you want to form, and how you're going to build capability. So those are the 7 benefit areas. But when you're building the business case, I think the most important thing that you need to do is go back to, what's the value that you're going to create. For Procter & Gamble, we were spending $3.5 billion a year on capital, and that was really to support our manufacturing operations. We did a few research centers and a few office buildings, but the majority of our capital spend was to support manufacturing. And typically those projects are not very straightforward. They can be very challenging, a lot of complexity. And so when we looked at it, we felt that of that $3.5 billion, that's the size of our program, that we had an opportunity for about $1 billion a year. We split that up into 2 parts. And the part you see on the left-hand side of the screen, that's $500 million that we felt we could reduce our capital spend. So when you look at that $3.5 billion number, we felt we could drop that by $500 million down to about $3 billion. The easy calculation on that was 15% of $3.5 billion, and that gives you the $500 million. But just as important, if you look on the right side, there was another $500 million out there. And where we saw that coming from was being able to get value from other sources. For us, as a consumer products company, speed to market is critical. And so especially with new initiatives. And so if we can get a new initiative out a month early or 2 months earlier, that's significant improvement in our return on investment. And so when we added up all those other things that were included, other value, we got up to another $500 million. And so we felt that, this value equation, the size of prize, I don't know if that's a common phrase that is used, but the size of the prize of moving to Lean IPD was about $1 billion a year. And so that was one of the first things that we did. And we just felt that Lean integrated project delivery was a better way to go ahead and deliver projects. The other important thing that this slide shows is that we saw value in 2 sources. We saw a lot of value in getting the design right. So one of the nice things about a Lean approach, especially an IPD approach, is you bring your partners in early, especially your trade partners. People in the supply chain who usually come in much later, you bring them in early. And by doing that, you get a better design. The other thing is we felt that we would get a better build. There is so much waste in the build side of it. And so if the designers, especially if they're motivated by the same contractual arrangements, they know that the only way they're going to get their profit back is if they go ahead and have the project has a successful build. And so from day one, if they know that, they go ahead and design to make sure that you're going to have a very efficient and effective build. And so the whole team is focused not only on the design, but they're also focused on the build. And so we kind of saw that as the two big sources of value. One, getting the build right, and second, getting the design right.
All right, Mike. Thank you so far. Now, I imagine, well, you have a board meeting, and in that board meeting, you make the decision, well, let's save $500,000. We saw all those dollar bills in the last slide. So that's a decision by the management board, obviously. Now, the next question, obviously, is how did you start? How did you move on within your organization to start that journey?
Sure. So the starting point was really developing that business case. And there was a number of articles out there. There's a lot of information about people who were already, if you look at the Lean Construction Institute, it's been around over 20 years. So a lot of people had been looking at, they saw the success for Lean in manufacturing, and we're trying to apply that to project delivery. So when we first got into this, we were very much trying to get educated. What is it out there that has been successful? This article by the Boston Consulting Group was done, I think, in 2013, 2014. And it talked about the Lean advantage for large construction projects. And that's exactly what we were doing at Procter & Gamble. And it talked about industrializing project execution to create that value. And so this article was one that I shared with a number of our engineering leaders and other leaders in the product supply organization. And what was nice about that is it talked about, taking this approach. You could have 30% faster schedules. You could lower costs by 15%. The people that you were going to partner with, the engineering firms and construction firms, they would want to do it because they could see better margins as well, up to 2 to 3 percentage points. And finally, the quality and safety, something that's super important to Procter & Gamble, that was not being compromised. If anything, you were able to enhance that. So again, getting educated, building that business case. The other really important thing we did was a lot of benchmarking. This is just a few of the firms we benchmarked with. We got a chance to go to Chandler, Arizona, and see Intel. They were building a $5 billion fab plant, and they were using a lot of Lean principles and practices. And so we saw that. We also got a chance to go down to Orlando, Florida, and visit Disneyland. And we saw a big room, which was being used using Last Planner, and how they had their conditions of satisfaction, how the team was using that big room really to work together, how they were using Last Planner to be able to create flow in their construction schedule. And so that was very helpful. And then finally, with BMW, we got a chance to visit BMW in Munich. Klaus Hauser was our sponsor. I think most people on this call probably have heard of or personally know of Klaus, and Klaus was super helpful as well. This is a slide that I used repeatedly that I got from Klaus, okay, and it was when he spoke at the German Lean Construction Institute conference back in 2015. And so one of my colleagues who was in Germany, Stefan Beckman, went ahead and forwarded this presentation. And at this point, we were looking into it, but we hadn't really made a whole lot of commitment. We were just sort of trying to understand how we could apply it. And so one of the things that was very helpful was BMW had a great success story down in Brazil. And so on this particular project, they were building the assembly plant for the i3. And they showed how by taking this approach, a Lean approach, they were able to reduce their cost by about 50% and take the schedule from 10.5 months down to 5.5 months. And one of the really nice things was this super simple approach that they took. And that was a TAC planning and scheduling approach. And we talk about flow. And what was so nice about this is this was a very simple way of being able to ensure that you were going to have flow in your construction and your assembly. And so these slides I used a number of times, and they really became part of our business case for going to Lean IPD.
All right, thank you very much, Mike, so far. I think it's interesting. What I take away now is that your starting point actually was the Lean aspect, the Lean approaches, where you saw where are different experiences. And I know Klaus Hauser and some of his colleagues are in this conference right now and are watching, so they probably would appreciate it a lot that you took reference to that. And now, how did it develop from that point?
Sure. As it developed, one of the things that we did is, I think you'll hear, and everybody will talk about Lean as a journey. And so what better thing to use than a journey map, which really shows the progression of your efforts. And so year zero, where we really weren't doing it, but we were just trying to educate ourselves and really get organized, you can see that that first item was developing the business case. The next item in there was this benchmarking, as I had mentioned before. And then what was really helpful with the benchmarking was to make visits, actually go see. And so I think that is another important Lean concept, is go see the work, go see it in action. You can read about it, you can talk about it, but actually seeing it makes a huge difference. We also had to develop internal champions and develop a partnership with our purchases organization. And then finally, we initiated pilot projects. And I would say that, the pilot projects are super important because, like I said, again, you can see it, you can do it, you can actually see other people do it, but until you start internalizing it and doing it yourself, you really are never able to, you'll never be able to implement it. Many of these projects were early projects. We weren't able to do full contracts on them, but we were able to start applying some of the principles and also some of the practices. So for example, we were able to do a project where we introduced conditions of satisfaction. We had a big room and we used last planner. And in some of these projects, that might have been the only real practices that we were using. Others, as we got further along, we were able to do, a full, where we were doing all the Lean principles and practices, as well as putting an IPD agreement in place.
All right, Mike, you mentioned the purchasing department, and this leads us to our next question, because I imagine if you start this kind of journey, which includes a lot of change of behavior, change of processes, change of roles even, so there may be people in the company who may not be convinced from the beginning, let's say it this way. So how did you approach that? How did you include the people necessary within your organization?
Sure. You're always going to have people adopt things at different rates, and some never do, right? So, one of the things we did is we found people who were interested and, were willing to go ahead and take that next step. Those people became sort of the early adopters. They became what we referred to as Lean champions. Those were instrumental to being able to make things work for us. And if you look, going back to that journey map that I shared just before, these were the same things that we used to get people who were directly working on projects, like project managers, design managers, construction managers. These were the same things. We developed the business case to help them as much as we did to be able to get our senior leaders to also support things. One of the things that we did is we didn't just try to sell it to our top management and then have management tell people this is now what you need to do. So we did not try to do a top-down approach from the beginning. What we tried to do is sort of start in the middle and work with people who were both directly working on projects, getting them started, adding some principles and practices to their projects, as well as starting to work with management and saying, hey, these things make a lot of sense. This is what we're doing. We're doing these pilot projects to learn more, but eventually this is where we want to go. Eventually, we're going to want to go ahead and get to a full IPD agreement type of a project. Sherman, as you mentioned, purchases was critical. And so of all those things during that learning phase, I would say the most important thing we did is establishing a partnership with purchases. This is actually a presentation that Cindy Deal, who is our Director of Capital Purchases, Cindy and I did this presentation at LCI back in October of 2018. And so the title of it was Purchases, Your Team's MVP. So typically MVP stands for your most valuable player, But in here, we kind of adjusted a little bit and emphasized that really that purchases was going to be our most valuable partner. Before we could partner with other engineering firms, other construction firms, other trade partners, we really needed between our engineering organization and our capital management organization, which were pretty much in the same, all part of the same engineering group, we had to get our purchases folks. They had to be front and center. I think we were able to get them because, first of all, they're a little bit more, they're very enlightened, let's say that, and they understand that value doesn't always come from the lowest price. Our purchases folks often buy other things. They buy a lot of non-commodity items, a lot of specialty items, things where there's only single sources. So you can't go ahead and hard bid on those items. So they understand the value of negotiating and they understanding the value of working together. They also buy talent. And so for Procter & Gamble, all of our brands work with ad agencies. And those ad agencies charge fees. But the value of your ad agency has very little to do with what fees they charge. It has everything to do with how they can benefit your brand and build a campaign. And so if you can increase the market share for a product like Tide or Downy or Pampers, if you can increase that market share even 0.001%, that will pay tenfold any differences that you might have in fees between different ad agencies. So I think they understand where value can be created, more so maybe than some other purchasing organizations that might be out there.
Very interesting. Thank you, Mike. Now, obviously, IPD is about integration and integration across boundaries. And I would like, together with you, look into the question how you manage to get design and construction partners on board at the beginning when you started, or maybe in new projects. What are the key success factors from your point of view? Or how did you do it, actually? Yeah.
Sure. So let me reference, these were a couple of our very successful projects. And these projects took place at our Tabler Station, West Virginia site. This was a greenfield site that we built, spent over $2 billion in doing it. There was a number of large projects. We had probably 6 large projects that were part of this $2 billion effort. And a couple of these projects we were able to do with full Lean IPD agreements in place. Those projects, I know the first one, the Ferrari project, we started a good 6 months before we were going to be breaking any ground. And part of it was we brought in CH2M. You can see they were one of the critical delivery partners that we used on this project, as well as Miller Valentine. We had done a previous pilot project with them where we had introduced some of the lean principles and practices, but we hadn't been able to put in an agreement. And so we brought them in and said, hey, we want to take the next step. Would you be willing to go ahead and take that next step and sign a poly-party IPD agreement? We also included Southland, and Southland had done this before. They had also worked with, for those not familiar with Southland, it's a large MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing subcontractor or trade partner. And they had also worked with MC Dean on some other Lean IPD projects. And so we were able to early on talk about how we wanted to do things differently, different than our previous. What we did was EPCM, a very traditional approach. It's just a hybrid of design, bid, build. And so, we brought them in early, told them what we wanted to do, and really started that work to be able to lay a solid partnership in quite early.
All right, Mike, you already mentioned that at the beginning you did not start with the full IPD contract. Rather, you started with other issues and other aspects. So maybe you can elaborate on why you took that approach a little bit deeper.
Yeah, so I think the key thing here, we were trying to build some momentum and also some understanding, and also finding partners that would be willing to take that. It's interesting. I mean, I had other owners who told me about when I was very interested in doing the IPD agreement. Other owners told me, this lean stuff is wonderful. It's great. There's all kinds of value in it. but I would avoid that contract. That gets real messy. And so, as I started to learn more and more, I said, yeah, it might get messy, but it also creates a whole nother source of value. And so if we don't do the contract, we are going to leave money on the table. And so I figured it was a matter of time. And so we first had to go ahead and get comfortable with some of the lean principles and practices. And we also had to build some momentum so that we could take that next big step. I think this graph right here, if people are not familiar with this one, they should get familiar with it. It is probably the one graph that says why you should go to an IPD agreement. The motivation with the traditional delivery method, you can see that for an owner, we're going to pay the cost of the project plus the profit that everybody else gets. And in most traditional delivery methods, almost every one of them, when the cost goes up, profit goes up because there's this fixed margin in there. So when you add change orders, you add scope, or things don't go well, whatever happens, if the costs go up, profits go up. What's so nice about the Lean IPD agreement is it flips that. What it does is if the team can figure out how to reduce the cost to the owner, which is that cost plus profit line, that actually goes down. Now, it doesn't go down quite as much as the cost, because what that allows is it allows the margin to become a variable margin and actually increase. So the team is able to make more money. The design and construction team, the critical delivery partners, can make more money with a Lean IPD approach. Plus, the owner can pay less. And so these graphs really show how Lean IPD enables risk and reward sharing. Now, that's the sort of the intellectual side of it, why it should work. This was actually proof. There was a study that was done by Renee Chang when she was at the University of Minnesota. If you haven't seen this study, this ought to be required reading for anybody who's going into Lean IPD. This study showed, and the conclusion was that IPD, or the agreement, sets the terms and provides the motivation for collaboration. Lean provides the means for teams to optimize their performance and achieve goals. And so this list of projects that they did a lot of study on, it said, it proved what those graphs were showing before. So intellectually it made sense, but then there was actual proof of projects that took this approach. What we saw at P&G when we finished most of these pilot projects, as we were knocking these out, we saw the same thing. And so in this particular graph, you can see project delivery methods, different types of project delivery methods, and what kind of value you get out of that versus lean intensity. So on that far left-hand side, you see lean practices. And that's really what we did with a lot of our early pilot projects. We were putting in lean practices, and we were very pleased. We saw value from doing that, whether it was introducing collaborative design sessions, being clear on conditions of satisfaction, using last planner, target value design, all those things were creating value for us. When we did projects where we did like a design build, and we had two partners, and those two partners would be a company that was doing the design build and Procter & Gamble as the owner. When we had those kind of things, and we were able to set a target cost, we saw even more value because now the right incentive was in place, just like you saw in that previous graph. When we were able to do three parties, we tended to get even more value. And typically with that third party, what that means is typically the design firm and the GC, the general contractor, are now equal partners. And interestingly enough, in almost all cases, when that is in place, you see more value. And then finally, if you go to Lean IPD, where you have a poly-party contract, not only are you using the design firm or the engineering firm, but now you've brought the GC, but now you start bringing in some critical delivery partners as well, like an MEP or a civil, structural, architectural type construction firm. When you start bringing them in, you get even more value.
Okay, you mentioned a couple of times now during your presentation the importance of lean principles, lean practices, also lean culture. I think we all are interested what are the things you understand behind those terms and what were the concrete methods you used?
Sure. So I think anybody who's been in this, you literally can be almost overwhelmed with the number of lean principles and practices that are out there. And so one of the things that we did kind of early on is we said, what are the ones that are going to be most helpful to us? And so when we laid these out, these were what we referred to as the 7 essential practices. There's other lean practices that are also very valuable, and you might get a lot from them. But for us, we thought these were like the critical ones, the essential ones. So first of all was partner selection, and that was the most important thing. You've got to identify and select people that want to work this way and want to come along on this journey with you. The second one was collaborative design sessions, where early on the project, you bring not only the design firm and the GC, but you bring in trade partners. In our manufacturing plants, we're bringing people in from operations to help. We're bringing people from maintenance. You're bringing in all the critical people that are needed to deliver the project. The concept of a big room, obviously challenging in these kind of conditions, but where you can co-locate people, you're always going to see improved collaboration when you can co-locate people. Conditions of satisfaction, a super simple concept, but incredibly valuable, where everybody agrees on what success looks like. We also found that target value design. And what's critical about target value design is almost what we do in the consumer product side is we call it price back costing. And so in other words, we look at what's the cost that it needs to be on the shelf, and then we go back from there and what it's going to take us to make that product. This is very similar. And so this was a concept that we were readily able to adopt because we understood how important it was on the engineering side to engineer products and to engineer manufacturing plants that allow us to deliver. So why would we not include that in our construction projects? And the other one was last planner. We thought that is super important. In fact, of all these, might be one of the top 2 or 3 practices that really make a difference. And finally, that IPD agreement. That was super important to us. All of these practices were able to help integrate the team. And so we refer to them as team integration practices, as well as our 7 essential practices. One of the things that, if you look at the lean practices, those first 6 are really the ones that you would call lean practices. And they provide the means. And the IPD agreement provides the motivation. So very similar to what Renee Chang, when she published that article, that research study, this became real clear to us that, okay, these lean practices are wonderful. They help provide the means, and then the motivation can come from the IPD agreement. And when you mentioned culture, I think what we found is that if you take these steps, if you start integrating people, what you will find is you will create a culture for collaboration and innovation. It almost just takes care of itself. It doesn't mean you don't have to work on culture. What it means is that you do all these other things as far as bringing the right people together, having the right processes that are going to lead to value, then you'll see the culture start to develop. I don't know what comes first, but in many cases, I think you start doing the practices and people will naturally start to collaborate better, and you're going to see greater innovation.
All right, thank you for those insights, Mike. With respect to the time, I would put the next 2 questions together, and the questions are: what were along the way your biggest challenges, and what were your biggest successes?
Okay, so I think challenges for all owners is very simple. Okay, these projects you have to have an engaged owner. You have to be certainly very, very involved. Trusting and trustworthy. I'm not sure how the interpretation will come out on this, but trusting means, an owner needs to trust the team, the critical delivery partners. The owner has to trust them. But the owner also has to be trustworthy. And so that's important too, because just even if you're trusting, but if you're not trustworthy, then others aren't going to trust you. And so that's why I emphasize that, and I actually underlined that particular word. So much of that will depend upon how transparent that as an owner that you are. If you're always holding things close to the vest, if you're holding your cards back, so to say, then it's hard to be trusting and also be trustworthy. And then finally, you have to be committed. You can't go ahead and get into this and then halfway down say, we'd like to do this agreement, but we're not going to do it because we can't get to a final target cost. And so now we're going to go ahead and bid the work out. If you do that, you will destroy so much of what you're trying to achieve. And so staying committed to the process, to the end, is really important. Shervin, I'll go ahead and as far as greatest successes, I'll just re-mention the project that we did in Tabler Station. Those were super successful projects. We were able to do poly-party agreements. We saw significant reductions in capital, and we also saw improvement in schedule. We also had a project a little closer to home. We had a project just outside of London in Reading, UK, and that was called our London Bridge project. And that project was noteworthy because even though it wasn't perfect, we actually started much later. We had a good part of the design done. We were starting to see trouble, starting to see some issues, especially around cost and schedule. And so we went ahead and did an intervention. And with that intervention, we asked ourselves, what's going to give us the best chance of delivering this project, delivering the conditions of satisfaction that we have for this project. And we felt that a Lean IPD approach gave us that best chance. And the reason for that is it focuses on value, waste, and flow, all important things. It would create that environment that we needed for collaboration and innovation. And we could introduce these 7 practices, essential practices that would help integrate this team, which at that time was really having trouble coming together and working together. And so we did sign an IPD agreement. It was only signed by 2 others. We weren't able to get the design firm to agree to the contract, mostly because so much of the design work was already done. And so they felt that they really didn't want to sign up for how successful the build was. They kind of very traditionally wanted to say, we've done our design work, we want our profit, and we're ready to move on, which is very different than what you actually want. But nonetheless, by having the general contractor, as well as the large MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing contractor, and P&G in a multi-party agreement, we saw really good success with that project. And we were able to meet our conditions of satisfaction.
I think for me, what was quite eye-opening when I saw your presentation in October, it was, at least I got the impression, and I have it now again, is that you took quite a strategic approach within your organization towards Lean IPD. So you didn't start just with the project and then let's see what happens, but rather there was a strategic approach. So what is the path forward for Procter & Gamble? I mean, you left Procter & Gamble, but I assume that you're still connected very well and you have the insights.
Right. So the one thing that was helpful is that we had put this journey map together. So everybody was able to see that, the critical thing that we needed to do was we needed to make Lean IPD the default project delivery method. And so we were able to do that actually before I left. We also talked about global, systemic, being able to implement that at that level to where we now had more systems in place to support it. We also wanted to move to where we would have a master IPD agreement that we could use. Basically, that would be very familiar in the industry. It would be based on some of the work that had already been done. We had previously done. We were able to use that not just one-off, but use that consistently so that when people said, hey, we're working with Procter & Gamble, they knew what they were getting themselves into. And then full integration was the last part of it, that we really felt that when PS, that stands for product supply for Procter & Gamble. So product supply includes manufacturing, It includes all the logistics as far as getting our products there. It includes engineering. It includes the capital purchases side, as well as the purchases for materials. So we really wanted to go ahead and make sure that we were fully integrated among those PS disciplines. So I would say that the path forward for P&G is obviously continuing to move on, but instead of it being sort of, are we practicing? It's like, no, we are now in the mode where we are trying to, continually improve. Everybody wants to see perfection. You're not going to get perfection, but how do you continue to build on your successes and incorporate those learnings? So Shervin, if I could just quickly hit what I would call our takeaways that I would like everybody to take is, first of all, is we found that Lean IPD, when you do a full poly-party contract, that is superior to any other project delivery method that we had seen. We also felt that the contract matters. I know we had a number of people outside of P&G, a lot of owners of other companies that said, hey, that gets messy, but it does get messy, but it is well worth your efforts. The other thing is that a lot of people will try to sell you tech, and they will try to sell you tech as the solution for the low productivity and some of the other issues that plague the engineering construction industry. I think technology is super important, but it's not going to be enough. What Lean does is it helps provide the work systems to make people work better together. And so if anything, the way I see it is that tech is wonderful. If you have the right work processes, you'll be able to leverage tech even more with Lean IPD. And then the final takeaway that I have is, the fix is integration. In fact, if you look at, when we talk about the 7 essential practices, we talked about them being also team integration practices. So how do you get, typically when you have a big project, you might have literally hundreds of companies that are having to come together for a very definite period of time. It could be a year, it could be 2 years, somewhere in that range to do this project. How do you bring all these different people together and have them work as one team and have one goal in mind? And so this integration is really probably the number one thing that you need to think about is how are you integrating these folks to be able to have a successful project?
Okay, Mike, thank you so far at this point. I would like to continue our little dialogue, which was a little bit scripted, I have to confess, but I would like to continue our little dialogue by including some questions from the audience. And I would like to mention for everyone in the conference, I just made the deliberate decision to use our buffer time, which we had put at the end of the conference, to give a little bit time now for this Q&A session to get as much as insight from Mike as possible. So I have a question, Mike, yeah, it's a very interesting one. It says from Matthias Nägele, what happens if in a project, for some reasons, the profit margin, which you have put in the pot, it ends up down to 0, and how can you get the companies to still perform well in that case? So I don't know whether you had that situation, but maybe from a practical point of view or maybe from a theoretical point of view, what would be your answer to that?
Yeah, so typically we did not see that, okay? For the most part, what happens is that profit that is out there, typically that may, what we did see a couple of times is people did not get the full profit that they were expecting, but we never had a situation where people were just getting their costs reimbursed. From a risk standpoint, in some ways, an IPD agreement protects people from that very worst case scenario, and that is where they're not getting even their costs reimbursed. So costs are always fully reimbursed in this. But you're right, you could have a situation where the costs get out of control and there's no profit at the end to go ahead and split. And I think that is, fortunately, we did not see that scenario, but that is, part of the, that is one of the scenarios that could happen. What I saw repeatedly is that even when project teams had hiccups, or issues, or in some cases, bad things happen to the team. If it was something that was within their control, they might have complained about, how somebody maybe didn't help them as much or whatever. But eventually they realized that that's not going to help them. What they've got to do is figure out how they're going to come back together and get the project done. And hopefully, if they're in a position where there's very little profit at that point, they're able to turn things around and get them going back to where now they're in a positive profit position. I was always impressed. Resilience is a word that is used quite a bit right now. We talk about resilience in our supply chain. We talk about resilience in organization. When a team signs a poly-party agreement, is their resilience to be able to handle things that don't go well just increases exponentially, because they understand that the only way they're contractually connected, and what they've got to figure out is how they're going to do well together. It's not going to be a matter of pointing fingers or anything else. They got to figure out how they're going to work better together to be able to get things right.
Thank you, Mike. I would like to add another question, which leads our focus towards value. You mentioned value at the beginning as an important motivation. And the question is from Moritz Püstow. And he says, Lean IPD offers incentives to reduce investment costs. How do you assure that shrinking investment costs do not lead to rising life cycle costs?
Okay. So one of the things that's really good, life cycle costs are the most important thing, right? So, if you have an opportunity to invest a little bit more money and it's going to lower your maintenance cost, it's going to lower your operational cost, you want to do that. Now, obviously, there's some financial calculations that need to be done to make sure that whatever you're investing in and whatever savings you're going to get in let's say maintenance or in operations, that it's a good investment. What we found is that we had a ton of really good ideas that the team would often develop as they were doing the design work. And so what they were able to do then is to go ahead and share those. And then it became a matter for the owner to decide with the team whether or not we ought to go ahead and actually do that. In some cases, it's a nice thing to do, but there's really no financial return. And those are always the most challenging one. It would be kind of nice to do that. Manufacturing would like it. It would look good. It might improve things a little bit, but you still then have to go back and put pencil to paper and figure out, is it really going to justify that expense? What we saw is a lot of times ideas that came out of the team certainly did pay. And so we actually invested more. The other thing that was nice is as the team got into things, a lot of time what they did is they were able to lower the cost of what things were going to cost. And so we had money now that was available to be able to do some of these nice to do things.
All right, thank you very much. The next question, I think, it goes a little bit to your international experience, since you were responsible for the global capital projects or for the capital projects globally. So the question is from Gunnar Schuchert from the Bayer company. And he asks, do you see differences between your European projects and your projects in the US, for example, in terms of mentality, culture? I understand that the full IPD contract probably was mostly used in the US, but you showed us that you also had experience with elements of that across the globe. So what would your answer be for Gunnar Schuchert?
So Gunnar, we saw some differences, obviously, when we tried to apply this around the world. I think it takes a little bit more upfront work, and also will take finding the right partners, people who are also willing to go ahead and take that next step with you. I think what that is sort of if I look at getting the contract in place, that is the end game. Some of the work that I've done with McKinsey, what they talk a lot about collaborative contracting, and they don't initially introduce the IPD agreement, but they will certainly agree that that is sort of the consummate, that is the end goal, that is nirvana, that is where you would like to be with your project teams to be able to have a poly-party agreement. That is the best that we know of contractually bringing a team together from the design, construction, trade partners, owner, and bringing a team together. That's the consummate. If you can't go there, there's still ways to be able to try to do that. They're never going to be as good. At least nobody's figured out a better way to do that. If you look at the work that went into putting in the IPD agreement, there was considerable amount of work there to try to make it a fair and motivational way of being able to do projects. And so that's, I think what we saw is that, the more, obviously it starts with selecting partners and finding people that are also willing to take that next step with you. We were able to do that in the UK. We were able to do that a little bit actually even in Japan, where we were able to do that on a large project. And we were able to do that in some cases down in Mexico City on some of our other projects. But that is certainly the end game where you'd like to be. And you got to work really hard to be able to get there. And sometimes, it may not be this project, but this project that you're working on now might set the framework to be able to do the following one. Just like our Ferrari project, we had previous experience on another pilot project. So CH2M and Miller Valentine were willing to go ahead and sign up for the IPD agreement, in part because we behaved differently as an owner in that pilot project that we did with them.
All right, great, Mike. Well, time flew by. Unfortunately, we have to come to an end, but we have most of the questions now from the audience, and I would like to say thank you again, Mike, for the time you took to be with us today. I think it gave us great insights in the journey your company has taken. It is quite impressive, and I think the approach you took is also gives us or other companies in Germany courage to start the journey. As you said, you don't have to start the full version, and still you can come to that point where you are now. So thank you at this moment, and at this point. I would love to come to the US in October, but this year probably it won't work. But please say greetings to the colleagues at the LCI board, and we of course look forward to have you with us in person at a point in the future. Mike, would you like to add something for the audience?
Shervin, thank you very much for this opportunity, and it was certainly my pleasure. Wish everyone well on their journeys, and I think being able to share, we would never have been able to do what we did if it wasn't for all the work that had been done before us, work that had been captured by the Lean Construction Institute, work that had been done by the founders of that, Greg Howe and others. So, you will find there's a lot of people that are willing to help you along this journey. And if it wasn't for those folks that had helped us, we never would have gotten there. And it's a journey, and so we still have plenty to do. We are by far certainly not perfect in our approach. We're still learning, and I think everybody knows in Lean, continuous improvement and learning is, it's neck and neck. They can't be done without each other. So thank you again for this opportunity, and best of luck for the rest of your conference.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike. Goodbye.
All right. Bye now.
Goodbye.